Good evening, virtual audience, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Hillary Carr, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with Melissa Fu, discussing her debut novel, Peach Blossom Spring, Join in Conversation by Helen Zia. Thank you for joining us tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community. Every week, we'll be hosting events here on our Zoom account. And as always, our event schedule also appears on our website at harvard.com, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. Tonight's event is part of Harvard Bookstore's New Voices in Fiction series, presented with GrubStreet, highlighting debut novelists discussing their work and the writing process. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event will also have closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to purchase Peach Blossom Spring on harvard.com. Your purchases make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings over this past year, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you in advance for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Melissa Fu is a writer and educator who has worked as a teacher, curriculum developer, and consultant. She was previously the David T.K. Wong Fellow at the University of East Anglia. She's won the regional prize of the Words in Women Prose competition and has been an apprentice at the Word Factory and a grantee of Arts Council England. She's the author of the poetry pamphlet Falling Outside Eden, and her work has appeared in several publications, including The Lonely Crowd, International Literature Showcase, and Bear Fiction, among others. Tonight, Melissa will be joined by writer, activist, and Fulbright scholar Helen Zia. After breaking ground as a graduate of Princeton's first co-ed class, she has been a community organizer, construction laborer, and auto worker. Her latest book, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, the epic story of the Chinese who fled Mao's revolution, was one of NPR's best books of 2019 and a finalist for a 2020 Penn Prize. These two will be discussing Melissa's debut novel, Peach Blossom Spring, which Vanity Fair named one of their 8 new books to read in March. Peach Blossom Spring tells the story of 3 generations of a family, starting with Mei Lin and her son Ren Shu as they flee across China to escape the Japanese invasion of 1938, and continuing through Ren Shu's relationship with his daughter long after he's emigrated to the United States. Georgia Hunter, New York Times bestselling author of We Were the Lucky Ones, called it a beautifully rendered meditation on the trials and triumphs of a family torn apart by war, which left me pondering how the stories we choose to pass down have the power not only to define us, but to buoy us, to help us persevere through the most challenging of times. We're so happy to have them here tonight. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours, Helen and Melissa.
Well, thank you, Hillary. It's so thrilling to be here with this amazing author, Melissa Fu, and her just launched novel that I understand it just was launched yesterday. So here we are with you today to have this incredible insight into your writing, this beautiful book, Peach Blossom Spring, and a multi-generational story that you have to share here. So it's my honor to be with you here. And Melissa and I had a little bit of a chance to talk earlier, and just how many parallels and overlaps we've had, because some of your story is in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and and then this epic story of the family that you tell about here that has some resonance with your own family story. So Melissa, I would just like to begin by inviting you to say something about how did you come to write this? Your story you chose to tell in a novel. Last Boat Out of Shanghai covers some similar ground, but in a nonfiction format. So if you could please share with us a little bit about your inspiration here and what set you off on this journey. You actually were a scientist starting out, right, in your early incarnation. So please just, tell us about that journey for you that brought you to this book.
Sure. Wow. Thanks, Helen. First, I'm just so pleased to get to speak with you and thrilled to be here. So what set me on this journey that ended up with a book I can hold of my own? I like to say that it starts with my father's fruit trees. So when I was a child, my dad was always trying to grow trees in our home in Los Alamos, New Mexico, fruit trees. And they were always a disaster. They never worked out. And it was a little bit sad, but it was a little bit amusing, the number of things that could go wrong with these trees. Then a little bit later, after he retired and my parents had moved to the town of Albuquerque, the city of Albuquerque, which is a couple hours south, he just threw some peach pits in the back garden. And he wasn't really thinking about it. And my mom came in the next spring and said, there are trees growing. And for the sort of last 10, 15 years of his life, he had this amazing peach orchard. And this just stopped me in my tracks. And I thought, I've got to write a story about this. So I wrote a short story about him and his peach trees. And I shared it with some writer friends. And they all said, well, this story is fine, but we think there's more, the characters, there's more to tell. And so I thought, well, if there's more to tell, then where do I start? And how do I do justice to what was so amazing that his trees finally grew? And I realized that I was so impressed with those trees because of who he was. And I realized that people needed to know who he was in order for them to appreciate how amazing it was that his trees grew. But I didn't know a whole lot about him. I had only about eight handwritten pages of notes that I took with my brother one time when my dad told us about his youth. And that was only one time. And I was in my 20s. It was after he had retired. And that one day he just started telling us about time in China, time in Taiwan, and his early years in the States. And I wrote down absolutely everything I could. I kept those pages for 20 years. I didn't know what to do with them. I just knew they were important. And then when I had this short story about the trees that seemed like it wanted to be more than a short story, and I had those notes, so this would be about 4 or 5 years ago, I thought, maybe this is the connection. Maybe I look at these notes from my dad and I have this story of the tree and I can connect them that way. Now, this is all factual, what I'm telling you now. This is a novel, it's fictional. And really, although he told us about his life, it was just an outline of places. And there wasn't enough I couldn't have made this into a factual story. There wasn't enough known, there wasn't enough remembered. And so it had to become fictional. And also, though he told us once, I just couldn't ask him again later. I could see how happy he had become with his trees, and I didn't want to have him revisit those sad times. So I thought, it can't be a true story, let's make it fiction. And that opened it all up. I started to research as much as I could about the Sino-Japanese War, the Chinese Civil War, those who went to Taiwan, the generation of Chinese who came to the US for graduate studies, some who stayed, some who went back. And I just thought there's so much, there's this amazing trajectory that this generation has followed. And I want to just pay tribute. So.
Well, it's amazing to me how much of that historical period that you captured in a novel that is centered around a young woman's struggle through that entire time, who, and I don't want to reveal too much, but turns out to be the fruit tree grower's mother, where you start the idea for the book. And it was, I have to say, it was just jaw-dropping for me, for having gone through more than a decade of researching that period, just to see how much you captured in there. And through the lens of these beautifully rendered characters that just make you care about them, the ones that you love, and even the ones who are a kind of, not such nice people, but you fill them out as real human beings and give them the context of what they were going through in China. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit about that, in your transition to seeing this as a fictional story that was set in a specific historical time. And so you had to do that research too. Coming from your father's story of the 8 pages that you had, and then crafting this around a young woman who lives through this time and lives through really kind of incredibly challenging, horrific things that she sees and experiences. And so I wanted to ask you about that. Her name in that character, your main character, is Mei Lin. And so I want to ask you how you came about to center it on through the lens of this fictional woman that you envision and brought to life. And before I do that, I just want to also acknowledge that today is March 16th. Today is a day of a horrific remembrance for especially the Asian American community and Asian American women, because a year ago today, 6 Asian American women were slaughtered by a mass killer in Atlanta. 2 other bystanders were also killed, and it really has triggered for many a deeper understanding and a remembrance of just this sort of stories and hardships and traumas that migrants, refugees, exiles, people who live through war and revolution and violence have gone through. So your character, in a way, to me, symbolizes the resilience and the determination to overcome, whatever horrors are thrown to somebody. And your main character, Mei Lin, certainly lived through many of those things too. So I just wanted to say, I think it's very appropriate for us to be having this conversation about your book today. And I think, given the times we are in, it's really an inspiring example of some of our community context, and what women of our communities go through. So I wanted to ask you about Mei Lin, your thoughts on that, and I think you have a reading too. The best way for listeners to know about your book and your voice and the life you gave to your characters would be through sharing some of that. So if you wouldn't mind, whatever order you want to take that in, to start with the reading, to talk about Mei Lin, to talk about the women characters in your book, and how you came to see them in your mind.
So I think I will start with the question about the main character Mei Lin, and then maybe I'll do a little reading, about her. So this shift to fiction was so powerful, and this is where she came from, because of all the characters, she is the most fictional. If you draw very loose parallels between characters in the book and my own life, one could say, oh, well, perhaps the father character is a little bit like the father, and is my father, and the daughter character is a little bit like me. The grandmother, while and the term we used for her was Nai. Well, I knew her a little bit. I didn't know her very much. So my real Nai. So that just opened this world up for me to create someone. And in my research, I wasn't so much looking at, political strategists. I mean, I read them too, but what I was really struck by in my research is how so many women held the country together, the country of China together at different times, doing different things, holding their families together, creating different, there was a sort of efforts to comfort and kind of nurse soldiers. There were an amazing array of schools that were started by Madam Chiang Kai-shek, Sun Mei-ling, and those were, staffed or run by women. So I would couple this with the one thing that I found out about women in China and around the time of the Republic is that they were, not only were they fierce and wonderful, but there was quite a women's movement going on, and there was a lot of education for women. There could be, I mean, this was becoming very important in the early, so my novel starts in 1938, but this, was becoming important in the late 1919s and 1920s, that they learned how to read, that they learned how to be, that they can be economically self-sufficient. And I wanted to sort of, there's a little bit of a conception that Chinese societies are very patriarchal, and they are. There is that, but there are also amazing women, and so I wanted to just bring that out. So that's a little bit where Mei-ling came from. And because she was so fictional, she just took over the story. When I told you about my inspiration, I was talking about my father and his generation and the trees. But the more I wrote, the more she became the central character. And I think she does remain the character throughout the book. We see her whole life and all that she endures. So I think, and triumphs over. So I'm so pleased that that we get to talk about her and celebrate her on a day like today, which is a sad anniversary of people not seeing what women in the many communities, Asian community, immigrant communities, not seeing them as the full, vibrant, amazing people that they are. So a little reading from my book. Shift gears. I was going to read from the very, very beginning, but I think I want to tell you a little bit more about Mei-ling, because there she goes again. She's stolen the show. So, and it's just, this is how we first see her. And if you imagine yourself back in 1938 in the Hunan province of China in the city of Changsha, it is a late afternoon in early spring. The air tingles with freshness, shaking off the last chill of winter and hinting at blossoms to come. Tiny leaves are opening on the trees, and each day the sun offers a bit more light. Inside Dao Hongse's kerosene shop, this is the patriarch of the family, Dao Hongse. The wooden floorboards are swept clean and the counter is clear. Dao Hongse can be seen speaking to a young woman who wears a simple dark green tunic. Her hair is pulled back in a bun, and though it is clear he is her superior, both in age and position, there is an air of mutual respect. Their relaxed postures suggest familiarity, even affection. He delivers news that illuminates her face, and although she doesn't embrace him, her elation is clear. Then he hands her a small silk bag and says something as she looks inside. She listens carefully, then responds. He considers her answer before replying, and they nod in agreement. She offers a bow, a half bow, and turns to leave the room. A light goes on in the room above the kerosene shop, and soon the profile of the woman can be seen in the upstairs window. Shui Mei-ling records the new inventory in her ledgers, her slim, quick fingers working the abacus. Lately, many of her father-in-law's customers have been trading gold and jade for kerosene. Everywhere, cash is scarce and the prices have been rising. Dao Hongse instructed her that these particular jewels are to be put in hock. The tearful customer who traded them for a week's supply of fuel pleaded with old Bao not to sell them to anyone else, hoping to soon be able to buy back his heirlooms. Both Mei Lin and Hong Zhe were perturbed by this deal, yet another sign of the encroaching war with the Japanese. But Hong Zhe accepted the treasures for payment, of course. He is, after all, a businessman. So I'm gonna pause there and skip a little bit to where Mei Lin remembers there's something that isn't in the book that's really important. She gets a beautiful hand scroll, and a hand scroll that Chinese painted scroll, you open it just a little bit and you see a scene, and you open it a little bit more. And I just want to take you to the moment when she gets this scroll from her husband, who's called Xia Wen. So Xia Wen handed her a box indicating that she should open it. Inside was a roll of silk brocade, creamy peony blossoms climbing a green lattice against a dark background. Gold threads traced an auspicious cloud pattern along the edges. Mei Lin caught her breath and stared at Xia Wen in disbelief. A hand scroll. Xia Wen nodded, encouraging her to examine it more closely. Mei Lin brushed off her hands, lifted it, and loosened the red tassel. Slowly, slowly, she unrolled the silk to reveal the first painted scene. Ancient, silent mountains, a rushing blue-green river, a group of travelers. She leaned forward to examine the delicate strokes, mesmerized by the fine detail of each bird, stone, and tree, the distinctions between the travelers' faces. It was astonishing, finer work than Mei Lin had ever seen. So she has this precious hand scroll, and it's going to be very important in the story.
Wow. Thank you, Melissa, for the reading. It just takes me back, and not only takes me back, it places me right there. And the way you set up these characters about Mei Lin. And so that just reminded me of something I wanted to ask you. You know, you were saying that, about Chinese culture having the traditional culture anyway, being patriarchal. And I feel like you captured so many nuances of Chinese culture, relationships, things that you just mentioned in passing, like, the pawn, that the family actually that Mei Lin has married into is a successful dealer in arts objects, but also things like pawn shopping, and your description of just that one transaction of a pawn, pawning off jewels and what that would mean. And so I felt that you captured so many things about Chinese culture, and not only Chinese culture, but Chinese culture very specific to that historical period. So I wanted to ask you about that, because there are things when I was reading your book, I just felt like, oh, wow, that was an interesting insight or reference. And so were you raised, steeped in Chinese culture? Was that something that you had to absorb? Did you grow up speaking Chinese? Because I did notice that there are many references where you actually used it, the Chinese words or honorifics or, dage or things like that, meaning older brother, but you don't actually translate it there. It's, and I felt like, that's great. You use the word without feeling forced to actually translate it. Let people just sort of pick it up. And so I'm wondering, from your own background, you come from a multiracial family, and, did your father teach you and your siblings Chinese and Chinese culture? Was that something that you picked up, and in the course of researching this book, that you were able to integrate that so seamlessly? And so, and to even use Chinese words without feeling like you had to explain them. So those were all things that I just really admired as I was reading your book, and just wondered, what were you drawing on to put those into your, into your characters, and just sort of, as part of just the daily life that your characters went through?
So my growing up, as you mentioned, I'm from a mixed race family, and we did not do very much, learn very much about the Chinese community or Chinese culture after a certain point. I think when we were little, we had little flashcards, and when my grandma came over, my nai, she brought some things. I remember some books, and I remember the occasional Chinese New Year celebration. But then after a certain point, we kind of, my dad said, no, don't. I don't want you to learn Chinese. I don't want you to speak it. Just, I think what he wanted us to do was focus on our lives there. And because I think he knew from experience how hard it is to live in two cultures. But I was curious and I wanted to know anyway. So I didn't speak. Well, I spoke a little Chinese. We went to classes when we were little, and then we stopped. I didn't for a long, long time. I sort of got so spooked by him saying, "Don't learn Chinese, don't speak it," that I wouldn't. But then I became more curious in the past few years. And my eldest brother, actually, who's very good with languages, he's one of these people who can just, you meet these people who are just language. They can learn languages. He's one of those.
Savants, right? Language savants.
And so he started to become more and more interested in the Chinese language. And I started to, okay, maybe if I just learn a few words. So the language it's a beautiful language. And I keep signing up for courses, and then maybe I'll learn a little bit and then something will come up. But I've come to the idea that I'll just learn a little at a time. The overall sense of the culture. This is a really interesting question, Helen, because I think I have absorbed it from friends, maybe who are Chinese, a lot of Chinese friends. And also, even though I think my dad was thinking he wasn't being Chinese, I have a feeling he was, because I remember a joke I had with a friend who also grew up in the same town. And we said something along the lines of, I said, I said, I can't do that because my dad just would really be so upset. And she said something like, "You're so Chinese about that." And I said, but in my research, I did want to get a sense of the culture. I read a lot of books. The choice of using the Chinese terms in the novel, and to not either define, italicize, or provide a glossary, that was a very conscious choice. And I think I wanted to put in the words when I felt like that I learned them, when those were the words that they just made the most sense to use the Chinese term. And the challenge that I set myself was to give enough context where I don't have to say, which means blah, 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 so that someone who knew the language maybe could get a slightly richer understanding of why I put that word there. And someone who didn't know the language could get a general understanding of what I meant. And so that sounds, I'm really pleased to hear that it seems to have worked, at least for you as a reader. Yeah, I think if you point out, if you're constantly pointing out, well, this is a different term that I'm using, and you italicize it, it yanks you out of the story, and you're kind of pointing out, well, this is different, and that's not what I wanted to be doing. I wanted just to be, no, this is the world of the story, and we will talk about these different terms and using.
So tell me about this a little bit more as a writer, and creating these fictional characters in another place and time. And did you ever feel nervous about doing that? I mean, and I'm asking you because I was writing, I'm not fluent in Chinese at all. I can't read it. It's partly growing up during the Cold War, when my parents felt that we shouldn't learn Chinese because it would make us targets. And, I regret that they ever thought that we shouldn't learn Chinese, but so we grew up monolingual. And so when I was writing about a period in China that it also incorporated words and time and people, and I couldn't read the primary source material in Chinese, I felt very self-conscious about that. And, every writer has that nagging voice saying like, are you sure you can do this? You're projecting into a thing that how are you capturing something that's really going to feel authentic, which I feel that you did. But what I want to ask you is, how you dealt with those. Did you have those voices? And how did you deal with finding the focus on making this character real? I mean, she felt very authentic to me. In relation to the hundreds of people that I interviewed who experienced what she went through. So did you have that, how did you capture people, create a fictional person of a time that you weren't part of, or not necessarily even modeling after anybody specific? Like, what voices did you have to either listen to or turn off, a muse that you had there?
So I definitely had those voices, right? How, what am I doing? I get through, I think, oh, what? but then, and I think unless a writer is sort of supremely confident to the point of being perhaps overconfident, there will be those voices, right? Thinking, do I did? And that to me is what the leap of fiction is, or the definition is jumping into someone else's consciousness. It's less whether it's did this happen or did it not happen, but actually, do you dare and to try to be in someone else's mind and point of view? And so those were, and that's sort of one of the things, this is fiction, and as fiction, that's the leap I'm going to dare to make. And whether I do it well or do it poorly, we'll see. But that's what I'm trying, and that gives me a closeness where that if the nonfiction, I would always have that distancing, a bit more of reporting. But then, so how did I capture Mei Lin's voice and her thinking? Well, I probably have people like you to thank. I should just point out to everyone, Helen's book is wonderful. and I read so much research of finding accounts, people's stories, so memoirs, or in this case, this is, focuses on four different people who left Shanghai and with different paths out of China, but they're still Chinese people. And as Helen said, she spoke with hundreds of people. So I tried to read and appreciate as many real life accounts as I could. And I think maybe that gave me a bit of confidence of imagining what had happened. And in the different situations, there was a series of memoirs from someone called Qi Pangyuan, who left China for Taiwan. There is a wonderful author called Han Suyin, who's known for her novels, but also she had 3 amazing autobiographies. The second novel, the second volume of which, called Birdless Summer, overlaps with very much overlaps with the time that my characters were in China and in cities. And then there was another book called Echoes of Chongqing, which looked at women's stories, women who were in Chongqing during the Japanese bombing of that city. So to the extent that I've got some of those voices, I think it's because there was so much amazing scholarship and research that I could draw on. And then I just poured all those amazing women into one, although I'm sure each of them would have been You know, you've met many of this generation, and they're just incredible people.
Well, I have to say, absolutely, they are. And you, I think, captured the essence of, just the struggle to survive in the middle of war and occupation and constant daily threats to survival. And so given the theme of the Harvard Bookstore series here, I think there will be interest in people knowing what your writing process was. I'm just so in awe that you shared with me your writing process to create this book was about 3 years, which to write about, even though you had been thinking about parts of this much earlier than 3 years, but you're actually diving into it, starting with the fellowship you received. And, to me, that's like, wow, you did all of this within that time. So you must have been, I'm imagining, researching, reading, and writing at the same time. I mean, please share that because I'm like, wow, you really got a lot in that time. Did you eat and sleep at all? I mean, so please, like, what was that like for our other writers out there?
So I was writing and researching constantly. I think a few things helped me make it not go on for many years. I think I could easily have spent another 10, 15 years researching, and it would have become even more interesting and more complex to just uncover more and more stories. But there was a bit of urgency on my end. I knew kind of a scene that I was aiming towards. I mentioned those trees, so part of the original short story, but I kind of knew something, a moment that I wanted to get to that happens late in the book. And so I actually wrote a synopsis for the whole story maybe 1 or 2 months in order to apply for this fellowship that you mentioned. And I think that was something very powerful in focusing how I went about it, because I thought, if it's a book, what does it look like? How do I describe it in 500 words? So I knew the arc I wanted to take. And so that meant that when I went down various research rabbit holes, and boy, there are some amazing rabbit holes you can go down, I could kind of pull back and say, right, but is that gonna, does that serve the story I want to tell? So I was pretty focused on the story I wanted to tell. And then, I don't know, before I started on this, the longest story I had ever written was about 5,000 words. And it was that short story. Before that, it would be short stuff, and I'd run out of things to say. But this just had a momentum like nothing I've ever written. And early on, before I knew what I was doing, I just would kind of get up every morning and think, touch the work every day, spend an hour, write the scenes. I had this document called 30 Scenes in Henry Dreams an Orchard, which was the original name. Again, Maylin, when she stole the show in the Center of Gravity, we changed the name. But this document from the original idea, and I wrote down, these are scenes I knew had to happen. I didn't know what order they would be in. I didn't know how I would get from one to the other, but it's just kind of a bit of scattershot. And then once I went on this the fellowship that you mentioned, I thought, I have to have a decent draft by the end of this, because this is sort of a once in a lifetime opportunity to spend a year just focusing on my writing. This fellowship, the only thing that was required of me was that I meet with a mentor about once a month and that I write. And he was fantastic, this mentor, because each time I went to him, I brought him new words, 10,000 more words, 7,000 more words. And I just kept pushing myself to get the story down. So I don't know that I was in a hurry, but it just absolutely needed to be written. It was urgent.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And that you were possessed, you had the writing possession there, And so in getting this first, was it a first draft that you had at the end of the year, that was what was driving you? Were there other drafts? Were there things that you had to go back and rewrite? Were there, and were there things that you learned, that you could share through this writing process?
Yeah, so I learned a lot. Let's see, before I started the fellowship, I started it with what I called a zero draft, which was about 80,000 words. That was from that, 30 scenes that have to be in this novel. And, it was far more than 30. And it was a stack of paper with lots of words that could be in the novel. And then by the end of the year, I had the first draft, which was maybe about 120,000 words, which is about the length of this. And it was a very bad version of the story I wanted to tell, but I knew it was the story I wanted to tell. And by bad, I mean very rough. There were parts I wasn't sure how I got from A to B. Some of the characters maybe weren't as solid as they needed to be. Then I was working with an agent who is an amazing, my agent is very, very amazing, and who had been an editor for many years. So she was willing to work with me on the manuscript. Sometimes agents prefer to have a pretty much finished piece of fiction before they'll take it to a publisher. But she read it through, and so I met with her. I remember it was the September 2019. She had read it. We had a long, amazing lunch, and she gave me a lot of feedback. Global, focused on character development. And then I worked on it from September 2019 to about January 2020, revising all of that. We got it ready for submission it went out on submission in February 2020, sold like 5 minutes before the pandemic.
Yeah, wow.
And then, but the year of, so then there was really 2 years of, 2020 and 2021 was revising. And I spent my pandemic revising this book. And actually I learned even more. I did a lot more research about China, find ways to put it in. I think the main thing, if there were writers out there, or just thinking about the process, it was starting with that synopsis. I knew where I went. I knew the shape of the story. Once I had the shape of the story, I knew there were non-negotiables, things I wouldn't change when my agent sold it. So the editors had a lot of changes to make. They were good. We kind of chopped out the last third. We added some characters. We added some new chapters, which we then chopped out again. But the main things that were so important to me, I knew I wouldn't budge on them, and that made me more willing to open it up to other eyes. And there was room for other people's input and stories. And that made it really joyful, because they would see something I hadn't, and I could think, oh, well, let's do that. Let's see how that works. So yeah, I think there's some balance between knowing the story you want to tell and also allowing yourself to be surprised by what other people see in the story.
Well, we have some questions, but I just want to ask you one other thing. Were you driven by something what did you hope people would take away from your book? Were you thinking that as you were writing? So when I was writing Last Boat to Shanghai, one of my desires was that people would see just the wide range of diversity of people in China, that the 1.4 billion Chinese are not one monolith there, but actually there's just a lot of class, regional, linguistic, gender, every way you can imagine, different political differences of people, and that I hoped it would humanize them, as well as people escaping war and going through difficult migrations and what a diaspora means. So that was sort of in the back of my mind, that it didn't drive the story, but it was something that I hoped would come out of it. Was there something, that for folks who are eager to pick up your book to, and read through it, was there something in your mind that you wanted to, sort of communicate there? Besides telling a beautiful story about, people who come to life off the page.
I think something very similar to what you were just saying about The Last Boat Out of Shanghai. And I would say that that's one of the things I really admire about your book, is that breadth of those 4 stories and the 4 families. So I think that I wanted, there's room for so many stories, and the term you used of monolith I think is really an important one to realize it. No culture is a monolith. No, not Chinese culture, not Italian culture, not and everybody is an individual and has these stories. So you can gain an appreciation, a general appreciation for our culture, but to appreciate the individuals in each story, I think is sort of what I think is, it would be kind of a hope for that this book upholds one particular set of one particular strand of the Chinese American or Asian American experience, in hopes that there will be other books that sing different strands, and it becomes a symphony, right, of many voices, as opposed to a monolith of just one word. And I'd also really like people to know how amazing those peach trees were. So, yeah.
So Melissa, in the time we have left, there's a couple things I'd like to do. There are 4 really great questions, and maybe I'll just get to the essence of each of the 4 questions in one fell swoop, and you can answer them as you wish, combine them, whatever. One question is, were there any novels you referred to as a model for your book to, tell the history? Another, did you have a model for Maylin's strength? Where did you, draw, what did you draw from for that? Whether it's a real historical figure or fictional figure. So those 2 questions are around models. And another is about the scroll. Like, what research did you do? Because you're very specific about the scroll in different places, what's in it, the significance and things like that. So about the scroll, and did those stories come first as part of the 30 scenes that you talked about that had to be in there, or with something like that added later? So, and then the last one is about the way you didn't feel like you had to explain what the phrase, Chinese words were, but so the question is, was it difficult to get away from the white gaze of, the imagined reader, the imagined white audience? Was that in your head, or were you able to pull away? So those are the 4 questions we have now. Oh, wait, there's one more. Let me just have a look. So I'm thinking maybe in the time left. Okay, I'll ask the last one later, because I do want to give you time to close with another reading if we have time. But so those, if you want to just dive into those questions about what you used for models, how did you, arrive at the scroll, and also getting away from the white gaze of the audience.
Great, those are awesome questions. Yeah, so I guess a novel that I would recommend to everyone to read, and that did make me feel like I could write this, is a novel called Do Not Say We Have Nothing by Madeline Tien. And if anyone in the audience knows me, they've probably heard me say how much I love this novel before. It is a beautiful novel. Madeline Tien is a Canadian novelist of Chinese Malaysian heritage. And it's so good. But I would say that she handles a similar many years of China in her novel. Her characters, very broadly speaking, her characters stay in China after the revolution through greatly forward through the Cultural Revolution. And her novel goes all the way up to Tiananmen Square. It also works a little backwards. I think it goes up to 2016, but kind of Tiananmen Square is very, very important in her novel. Anyway, that was, besides being just astonishingly beautifully written, it was like, I just was shocked when I picked it up in the bookstore and started reading it, because I thought, this is possible. Here is someone telling a story, and it goes through many years and generations, but these are the stories of stories of people who stayed. I want to tell a story of some of the people who left China. So that would be one of the novels. The model for my Lynn's strength, this is the thing with the fictional characters. I think she absorbed the strength of all the research I did about some of those many, many, many amazing women, and she just became her own. So she just took over. I'm glad she did, because she kind of knows how to do things. And the scroll. So the scroll that I introduced there, one of the things that happens in the book with the scroll is she shows it to her little boy Ranshu in times of real distress, and she'll pick out a scene and she'll tell him a story, and it's usually a Chinese folktale. And I think I got it really interested in the hand scrolls. I think the first time I was at the British Museum. I'm here in England, and there's one called the scroll, the admonition scroll, and it is the admonitions to the ladies of the Empress on how to proper behavior, and that's the text. But if you look at the pictures of that scroll, it's actually a little bit subversive. Like, the strongest figures in that scroll are the women. There's one scene in particular where, and I think it's Empress Fu, or Lady Fu, she's fighting a bear, and the emperor is like quaking, in fear behind her. And there's a lot of scenes where actually the women are very strong. So that was the first one that I thought was wonderful. And then there was another one called Going Upriver during Qingming, which is April holiday, to revere the ancestors. And this just has so many little details, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And there's a copy of it, and one of them is in the National Palace Museum in Taiwan. And it's so charming, because you see carts and you see animals and you see people playing. And I think that was kind of what caught my imagination. Of course, there are stories, and I wanted to, I just love the scrolls, so I just put them in the story. You're going to write fiction, put in things you love. That last question about, was it difficult to get away from the white gaze? So early on, I had a friend read some of it, and or not a friend, well, a writer acquaintance who I admire very much. And she asked me this question. She said, "Who's your audience? Who are you writing for?" And I thought about that for so long. And in our conversation, I said something. I don't remember what I said, because am I writing for people who don't know anything about China, and do I need to explain everything to them, or am I writing for people who already know this history, and I don't want to be explaining to them what they, what is it, the expression, teaching your grandmother to suck eggs? You don't want to patronize. And it became an impossible question. Who am I writing for? Who is your audience? That would have stopped me more than the voices we talked about earlier, Helen, about, how dare you write? Mine was, who are you writing for? Who are you? So I just thought, I'm writing for me. I'm writing for someone who, and I wrote it for me. And in that sense, I stopped thinking about all these questions of white gaze or whose story is this. That would have just paralyzed me. I'd still have a big stack of paper. I just wrote the story I really wanted to write, and wrote a prose and presented it in a way that I felt that at the end of the day, I was happy with how I wrote it, or if I felt like I had done my absolute best, then that's what I could do.
Well, you did it so beautifully. And
Oh,
so one question, is there a book or books that you recommend for everyone to understand more about this time period? And then let's just close that with that reading that you have.
okay. So one book, well, if you get my book, in the back, I have listed in my acknowledgements many of the books that I loved, and that I used for my research. I mean, I think a book that could be really interesting to read about this time period, if you like memoirs, could be Jessica J. Lee's Two Trees Make a Forest. She's also a Canadian Chinese writer of mixed race background, and goes over quite some similar ground as my book. So Two Trees Makes a Forest, and oh, there's so many. Look in my acknowledgements.
Okay.
Or read Helen's book. This is also, I mean, but there's, yeah, it's those are two nonfiction, and I imagine there will be more novels coming down the line.
Well, people will be looking at your novel as a model for how they could do this beautifully and well. And so we have a couple minutes left. Melissa, you're just amazing. You're an amazing writer, novelist, and I hope this is the beginning of like a whole, bunch of other books and novels that you're going to be writing. And maybe you'd like to close with, that last. You said you had another bit to read to us.
Yeah, I'm going to close with the very beginning of the book. So those of you who are out there, and if you have your book, or if you're going to go order one from the Harvard bookstore, I'm just going to leave you on a cliffhanger, and you will have already started. So this is like getting a head start on your homework. So this is the first page of the book. No explanation needed. It's called Origins. Actually, I want to show you one thing before that. This is my dedication, and that is my family and my father's Chinese name. So, origins. Tell us, they say. Tell us where you're from. He is from walking and walking and walking. He is from shoes filled with holes, blistered toes, and calloused heels that know the roughness of gravel roads and the relief in straw, in grass. He is from staying each night in a different place, sometimes city, sometimes country, from roads that wrap around mountains and dip through valleys, from waterways shrouded in fog and mist. He is from walking across China. Tell us your memories, they say. He remembers kerosene lamps burning low, the smell of wood smoke, cold stone floors under his bare feet, urgent voices, the rasping of coins, carts creaking at night. He remembers a sandalwood puzzle picture. One way up, there were 100 monkeys. Turn it over, there were 99. How did that monkey appear and disappear? He is from this mystery. Tell us more, they say, as they nestle by his side. How did you come here? He crossed rivers. He crossed oceans. He carried a watch. He carried a watch bought from a sailor, a letter to open doors, a suitcase, a packet of light blue aerograms, a single pair of wool socks. He went toward the call of a beautiful country, a beckoning dream, a promise made of air. Toward wing beats of birds, kaleidoscopes of seasons he'd never imagined before. And now, they say, their eyes clear. Oh, I wasn't going to do this. Their eyes clear and their voices playful. Tell us a story. To know a story is to stroke the silken surfaces of loss, to feel the weight of beauty in his hands. To know a story is to carry it always, etched in his bones, even if dormant for decades. Tell us, they insist. To tell a story, he realizes, is to plant a seed and let it grow.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much. Now I know why you're more than characters, why your story is so true to life and sings off the page. There's so much humanity and emotion in it. So thank you so much. Thank you for reading that. Thank you for bringing this book to the world. I'm grateful to have been able to read it and to be part of your launch here. So, you know, all the best for what comes next and this book.
It's delightful to speak with you. Really, really nice tonight. So.
And I have a million other questions, but I see Hillary there and she's going to tell us that we're out of time.
We are out of time. I'm sorry. But this was really beautiful. Thank you for sharing this with us and for joining us tonight, both Melissa and Helen, and thank you for that beautiful reading. Thanks to everybody out there for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about the book and purchase Peach Blossom Spring on harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we want to say have a good night, keep reading, and please everybody stay well and safe. And thank you guys both so much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
All right.